Hey everyone, welcome back to this cold email course with Growth University. Today we're going to be diving into cold email strategy. Super exciting topic, something I talk a lot with various individuals from clients to our existing team. So let's dive in. For today, this is our following agenda. We're going to go over where you're reaching out to and why. Uh, what do you want them to do? How to use cold email in your sales or marketing funnels. What assumptions and experiments do you want to run and validate? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but we'll dive a little bit deeper into today. And then finally, like, are you trying to personalize at scale or get eyeballs? And I'll talk about what that means towards the end. But super exciting topic. Let's dive in. Uh, First off, let's talk about from a strategic perspective, you're trying to answer these one of these two questions. What are you trying to achieve with cold email, or what are you trying to communicate to your prospects? If we had to sum up all of cold email strategy, you're trying to answer one of those two questions. So please keep that in mind, and it does take quite a bit of thought. So whenever you're launching a campaign, before you launch it, just think about that. Okay, what are you trying to achieve, and what are you trying to communicate? Let's dive into who are you reaching out to, which is a question that I feel like not enough people ask. But the first step we want to do is build out a persona. An ideal customer profile is also what it's called, or an ideal customer persona. I like this definition, which I got from another agency called Seven Figure Automation. They say that the buyer persona is designed to achieve actionable insights that facilitate messaging, prospects in the most effective way. It ensures a shared understanding across your company about the profile of the ideal buyer. Sit down with anyone in your company who touches your customer, add as many personas as you need to, right? So, the first thing you want to do is start building out a persona. There's a lot of great literature out there. We have a framework we're going to introduce right now, but something I really want you to start getting into a good habit of is like, okay, when I launch this cold email campaign, who am I trying to reach out to, and which persona is this actually appealing to, right? um, on that note, like, who is your ICP, or is your ideal customer persona? These are some of the questions you probably want to be asking yourself, is like, what problems does that person want us to solve? Do they care about any of your offerings, whether you're offering a product or a service, right? Where do you find them, and what is your average deal size and contract duration? At a very high level, you need to be able to answer this. Here's a great framework that we've put together for you. Um, I would really encourage you to fill this out of the first few times, and then as you get in better at it, you'll see you won't have to fill it out each time because it'll come to you naturally. But some of the things you want to go over is like, okay, fine, like for this, for this individual, this job title at a specific company, we'll go over an example in the next slide. What are all these different elements around, like, what's their role, what's their goal, and like, you really want to describe the persona's role in the organization, like, do they have specific objectives? How does that individual measure performance? What titles are they, right? um, well, Not enough individuals do this, but really start to think like, okay, what does a day in their life look like, right? Do they have any specific things that they need to achieve daily? What do they struggle with on an everyday basis? A lot of individuals come back to me like, hey, I have no idea what like, where do I even get this information from? Like, this is really important. Either you go interview these individuals, or you can go look up online and do enough research, like, through different job descriptions, through different forums, or even like job boards like Glassdoor, and like, you should be able to gather a pretty decent understanding of like what this individual does on an everyday basis. Moving on to the purchasing process, again, something a lot of people don't consider is like, okay, am I reaching out to the buyer directly? If you're in the lower end of like freelance or SMB side, that's fine. But if you're talking like mid-market or enterprise, the person who's using the product is probably not the person who's buying it, right? So like, internally, like, what does that purchasing process entail? Is procurement involved? Is another buying committee involved? Like, who's on that buying committee? Again, like, it's very hard to understand this off the bat, but that's where your research comes into play, right? And the best type of research, in my opinion, just going out there and asking those ideal customers for a user interview and asking them about this type of stuff, right? Uh, this is probably the most important section is like the problems, like what problems or organizationally or day to day is this person struggling with, because this is really where you're going to hone in on from a messaging perspective. The last is like, what benefits would your solution create for this persona? Like, is it going to help them save time? Is it going to help them gain more money? Is it going to help them gain more insight? But really try to quantify the benefit if you can, right? So highly encourage you utilize this framework. There's a bunch of other frameworks out there. This is the one that we use internally, um, and it's nice and simple, but it'll help you get started. Again, this is not definite. If you feel like you're in a more niche industry and you need to add more rows, then go ahead and do that. This is more utilized to help you identify like who is the right person is that you need to outreach to, right? So let's go through an example that if I want to go through hit up growth marketers um, at venture funded SaaS companies to tell them about Growth University and their programs, right? So in this case, a growth marketer is responsible for the full funnel of marketing and sales. It may differ from B2B to B2C, so I need to take that into consideration. They're using multiple tools and platforms to drive revenue, and they're being measured among multiple KPIs. And they run experiments. Ideally, a day in the life of, they have to keep track of so many different campaigns. They're doing a bunch of meetings with internal people and external. They always are asked around something around conversion rate. Hey, what's the conversion rate on this campaign, or what's the conversion rate on this process that you've done? They probably have a struggle with keeping up with all this data and putting it all in one place, right? Purchasing process, it will differ the con if the content's online versus uh, having an instructor. They'll probably go and ask their peers and look at their network and see like, hey, what's the best like course? In this case, because I'm offering courses from Growth University, they may purchase it and expense it, but definitely what they're going to be doing is diving deep into the programs and looking at the case studies and stuff like that. In this case, the reason I say only purchase and expenses is because Growth University's cost is fairly less compared to like when you need to get like an enterprise procurement team involved, right? So this is typically a product that they can expense, right? Moving on, let's look at problems. Um, some growth marketers, because it's a fairly new role, they don't have access to senior growth marketer to ask questions. They're on a small team, they may get stuck, and especially when campaigns are performing well, they don't have anyone to really soundboard off or seek advice from. Um, a lot of growth marketers are kind of thrown into that role, and they just need to kind of figure it out as they go. So they may not know how to communicate results in a clear manner. They may struggle also with convincing leadership to invest more in experiments, because leadership will always say, hey, I want to see ROI straight away. Um, and most growth marketers they may have like one or two channels where they're specialists in, but other channels they could be generalists in, so they're not as familiar with other channels. um, and again, it's a lonely space, and they may not know any other growth marketers, right? The benefits of enrolling in Growth University is like, hey, they have immediate access to content. They get great frameworks to help them with decision making and reporting. They'll get access to senior growth marketers via officer hours to discuss problems and experiments, and they also get access to a Slack community of other growth marketers and founders, which ideally solve those problems, right? So what I've done here is I've really like mapped out this persona. What you could do is like, put a face to it. You could also, give this individual a name and all of that type of stuff. That's fine. If you need to kind of present it to other individuals, I would encourage that. But for the purpose of today's presentation, what we really wanted to identify is like, hey, what's the best way of thinking about a persona? And the main part is like, what problems does that persona face, because we're going to utilize that in our messaging. Okay. Again, highly encourage you use something like this. And again, there's a lot of great literature out there to take this further if you need to. But prior launching to any of the campaigns, really start to think about this. The next question you want to ask is like, why are you reaching out to this individual, right? Are you there to generate general awareness? Do you just want to educate in general? Are you asking for a backlink, which has become more common? Do you want to book a time to chat with them? Are you asking for a referral within the internal organization? Are you trying to understand more about the organization or the persona themselves? Like do a user interview or qualitative survey, right? Like again, these are just some examples, but we talked about this before. Is like, what do you want them to actually do, right? Which is what I said, like, what exactly do you want them to do? So, like, multiple call to actions are available. Let's put it that way. You can ask any of these individuals, like, okay, fine. Do you want them to invite them to a webinar? Do you want them to speak on your podcast? Do you want to book a meeting? Do you want to push them to a landing page or sign up for a trial? Do you want them to read a case study? There's a lot of different things you can get a person to do. So you really need to decide, okay, fine, like, why am I reaching out to them? What what do they want them to do in response to that, right? So something to really, really carve and so something you really need to think about, because I've noticed that a lot of individuals, they'll just launch cold email campaigns and they'll be like, hey, I want to take a meeting with you. Here's my Calendly, which is completely um, a poorly uh, put together cold email campaign. Um, After that, what you really want to do is start looking at like, where does cold email fit in your funnel, right? One of the things I'd like to make reference to is this, which is called Schwartz 5 stages of awareness. Cold email in general is a top funnel activity. What this funnel or what this, I guess, concept tells me is like, how does your prospect think about uh, how you should go about thinking about where your prospect is as per this framework, right? So Schwartz is like a really intelligent marketer. He wrote a couple books, and one of the things he came up with is this 5 stages of awareness. The person can be problem unaware, problem aware, solution aware, product aware, then most aware, right? Um, Majority of your prospects are sitting in the unaware bucket, right? So if this person has no idea that they don't have this problem, how do you go about pushing them further down these different stages, right? And that's really where education is required, right? The golden place to be is like identifying prospects who are problem aware. So as you're going about your ideal customer profile, that's the reason we have that problem bucket, right? Like, how do we identify people that are facing these problems, and then just go ahead and ask them like, hey, if you're facing these problems, then this solution could be useful for you, right? So I really like this diagram. It's something I wish somebody told me when I was first starting out, because the fact is not everyone's going to be interested or even care about your solution, and that's simply because they don't have that problem, right? So really spend the time to think, okay, fine, have I identified the right prospects and are they problem aware? Or am I going after a brand new audience and I need to educate them? So something really to consider. The other element is like, if somebody does reply to my email or engages with the content I send them, like, what happens next, right? Do you need to call them? Do you need to add them on LinkedIn? Do you want them to book a meeting? I think where a lot of individuals fail at this is like they don't think beyond the campaign. They just think, okay, fine, I'm just going to send a cold email and see what happens, right? Your funnel will not flow this way, right? What you really need to think about is like, okay, fine, I'm going to send a cold email that could give me 2 or 3 touch points. And ideally, I get the best outcome is either they book a time with me or they engage with my content, and that gives me enough intel so I can go and maybe start the conversation on LinkedIn, or maybe I'll pick up the phone and call them, or maybe they respond back and you, instead of playing email tag, you'll call them and be like, hey, listen, my name's Ahan. We were on the email thread together. It might be easier if we just speak on the phone rather than going back and forth, right? So again, like think touch points and think like what's next and what do you want them to do as well, right? Another thing you should really be considering is like this is a very experimental, especially if you're setting up this channel, everything's going to be experimental driven. So like what experiments should you be doing, right? Um, I tell this to a lot of our clients and to a lot of individuals that I talk to about cold emails. Like every campaign is an opportunity for you to learn. So don't just launch a campaign for the sake of it, of trying to hit some number. Like every campaign should have a very specific goal, or because it's a specific opportunity for you to learn more. So always consider that. You can make a nice grid on Google Sheets and say, okay, if I'm going to be launching these campaigns, I'm testing out these assumptions, right? Which is brings us to the next slide, which I've talked about earlier, is about like what assumptions are you trying to validate or invalidate, right? Are you looking at changing up the messaging? Are you looking at changing up the list and seeing which prospects are correct? Are you looking at swapping out different value proposition? Value proposition A versus B is performing better, right? Or are you looking to validate any big bold ideas? Okay, let's go and try something brand new. Let's go and invite them to a webinar instead of booking a meeting with them, right? Straight away, how are we going about doing these different campaign ideas, right? Last thing I would want to talk about, because I get asked this quite a bit, is like, hey, can we use cold email to personalize at scale or get eyeballs, right? Personalize at scale is this fairly new concept, I'd say, that came out in the last 2 years, but it's this whole idea where you can take a small group of prospects, research them really well, and take specific key pieces of information, plug them into CSV, and throw them into cold email. So this is kind of what it would look like, They're like, hey, first name, throw in a custom intro. So you type that out for like 50 people. And this is what I would use for something for Growth Rhino. How are you currently generating qualified leads? If you want to drive revenue and fill up your pipeline, you may want to consider cold outreach. My company, Growth Rhino, is a sales agency that's helped build the outbound program that venture funded startups like. And then based on who we're doing the outreach to, again, because it's a smaller list, I'll be able to plug in relevant case studies or with the respective links. Would it make sense to continue conversation? PS, we recently did this, and then insert like a relevant piece of content, right? This obviously, because of the variables, does require quite a bit of information. So the whole idea of personalization at scale is I'm going to go in and like research 50, 60 prospects or even 100 prospects really well, put in all these fields, and then send them out. These are all custom fields, and I would say this is a little bit more advanced, but it does get the job done if you want to go super personalized, as long as it's very relevant to your prospects. You're not throwing in random pieces of information, right? Even for the custom for first line, and we'll talk about some of this in the copywriting section. Again, the advantages of doing personalization at scale is like you will get relevant messaging. It's going to be very personalized and it's very research driven. The disadvantages is that like it takes a lot of time, and like you really need to make sure your ICP is correct, because if it's not, then it's a waste of time, right? So like you want to make sure that, okay, fine, like I know I need to reach out to, for instance, growth marketers at venture funded companies versus growth marketers at company size of like 1 to 10 because they cannot afford my services, right? So you really, really need to hone in on this, right? It's best utilized when you're doing account-based prospecting. So when you're going after very specific accounts, or where you're going after like larger deals, mid-market and above. That's when I would really look at personalization at scale. The other side of it is to do mass outreach, and which is called getting eyeballs. And this is the more traditional way of cold emailing. You build a list and you throw in a couple of variables such as first name and company name, and you send it out, right? So this is on the other side. I guess the key thing that you want to understand is like, what are you trying to communicate to the prospect or persona or group or audience and stuff like that, right? Like if you're planning to invite a bunch of individuals to a webinar, you don't need personalization. It's easy to communicate the context, and the next step is very clear. It's like, hey, we're doing this webinar. You're going to learn 1, 2, and 3. If you're interested, sign up now. Here it is, right? It makes sense to use cold email outreach at scale or at mass to do that, right? But if you're prospecting enterprise accounts where it does require a lot of research and personalization, it doesn't make sense to do mass outreach then, right? So consider this as you're going about your strategy, right? I think that's a big factor that a lot of people always like really miss the boat on, because they'll jump into enterprise or mid-market prospecting and they'll just build a huge list and go to town. So I just talked about this. Is like, again, it really depends on how you're going about it. Um, a lot of people ask me like, hey, like this is really hard to choose from. One of the things I always recommend is that, like, if you're in doubt, run small campaigns and always be experimenting with things like your copy, your cadence, and who your ideal customer persona is, and make some tweaks here and there. But you want to get to the point where you understand your ICP well enough so that you can say, okay, fine, you know what, my ICP does require a lot of information, so I'm gonna go personalize at scale. But maybe some individuals are like, hey, we don't really need much, we just need to generate enough awareness, push them to our website, our landing page will take care of it, the rest, right? So the key thing here is experimentation. I cannot emphasize this enough. Experiment, 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 especially in the early days, and identify which one is the best for you, right? Um, just to wrap up, here's some tips I've found that helps me formulate the strategy that I'd want to share with everyone. The first thing is, if you recall, that Schwartz 5 stages awareness, right? So the people at the bottom, so the last stage is product aware and like they're ready to buy mode, or let's say. Um, Keep in mind that only 2% of your audience generally is in ready to buy mode. The rest of them are like everywhere else in that funnel. Okay. So you need to ask yourself, are you communicating to the 2%? If so, like, are you sure you're communicating to that 2%? Have you identified the right parameters to say, hey, these people are in ready to buy mode? Or are you communicating to 98% of the rest, right? And I think a lot of people get the two variables mixed, uh, and they'll just go and they'll just cold email everyone, be like, hey, this is what we do, book a meeting with me. And that's a complete wrong way of going about it, right? So something to consider. The other thing that I found working with, again, various different clients is that, like, cold emailing, for instance, for professional services versus a SaaS product is very different, right? Professional services require things like brand and like subject matter expertise and a whole different array of different things that you need to like communicate, right? Uh, versus when you're a SaaS company, it's like, hey, you have a problem, our SaaS product solves that problem, right? So it's a little bit more binary, versus professional services require a little bit more like the individual to jump in and stuff. So just like keep in mind, like, you can't take tactics from one and deploy it for the other, right? Each have a very different buyer journey. Again, it will depend on like things like how big the company is and all of that, but just something to consider, um, because they're fundamentally two different things. So you want to approach it differently. This is pretty important, but I feel like a lot of individuals forget this, but like, you can't force a need for your product or service. You can't just go to an individual and be like, hey, like, you should really use this, book a time with me, right? That's not how people buy. That's not how people find things online, or any of that, right? What you really need to do is really flip it and be helpful and provoke curiosity and generate interest, right? You know, there's a lot of different techniques, and we'll cover a little bit about this on the copywriting side. But like, you know, you can do a bit of creating FOMO, but which is fear of missing out. But what you really want to be doing is going in there and be like, hey, I truly believe that this product or service can change the way you do business, right? And that's your should be your approach. It shouldn't be going and like trying to forcefully put your product or service on this individual. Um, One thing I think I really stand by is that, like, research and relevancy will always win over anything else, including like hyper personalization, right? If you've truly identified the right ICP, it could be a matter of just sending them a one liner cold email like, hey, we solved this problem for you with this product, are you interested in chatting, right? Like you don't need to go super jazzy with the personalization, right? I've seen a lot of individuals go crazy with the personalization and they'll do like 5 to 10 touch points and hit up the same prospect across different channels. And then the prospect will come back and be like, hey, we don't even like use like the basics of what you need to uh, the basics of your product, right? For instance, if your product is integrated, like it's a Salesforce CRM or HubSpot CRM like add-on, like you need to be 100% sure that individual is using HubSpot or Salesforce, right? So I've seen a lot of individuals that will just go and like they will just spam and hit up a lot of these individuals and do a lot of these touch points, and they've not done their research. So always remember, research and relevancy will always win over anything else. Um, the other element that you need to think about is, cold email outreach will also depend on like the company size. So like when you're doing outreach to someone at company size of 1 to 10 versus an SMB or mid-market or an enterprise company, very different, right? And this information is like usually readily available on LinkedIn, so you should be able to access it, right? Not enough people think about the overall buyer journey, of like, hey, how things are going to move forward. Okay, fine. How will this person, like this individual, actually utilizes my product? Like, what's the actual end goal of it? Like, also, how did they discover my product? How did they discover and how did they make buying decisions and all of that type of stuff, right? Again, there's a lot of great literature on that. I would encourage you to read up about it. But like, finally, you want to always ask yourself, like, does this make sense? Like, would I respond to this cold email? Like, give it to a few others to review and like be like, okay, does the next step even make sense, right? If a person comes back to me with a bunch of questions, do I have enough of the information to give them an appropriate answer, right? So just something to consider. That's it. This was a little bit of a heavier lesson. Appreciate you staying with me till now. Again, a lot of information to process, but if there's any questions, please let me know. In the meantime, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next session. All right, bye.